Welcome to Conversations on the Future of Higher Education featuring California's candidates for Lieutenant Governor. Welcome everyone this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Monica Lozano, President and CEO of College Futures Foundation, to the stage.
Thank you and welcome everybody. Note to self, don't touch the mic. We want to welcome you to Conversations on the Future of Higher Education featuring the candidates for Lieutenant Governor. I am Monica Lozano, President and CEO of the College Futures Foundation, and we're pleased to co-host this event with California Competes. This afternoon, we shine a light on the role California's Lieutenant Governor plays in higher education. We will hear from two candidates about how they plan to ensure a better future for California students as they move to and through our public college and university systems. We believe it's vital for voters to understand how and why this role and this race are so important to our students and to the future of our state. Our aim today is to make higher education a front burner issue for California's elected leaders, for they have an obligation to respond to and plan for the needs of California's residents. Today, the vast majority of California's K-12 students are students of color and low income, yet they face numerous barriers to attaining bachelor degrees, and they comprise too small a proportion of graduates from our public universities. College Futures believes that ensuring their college success is vital not just for themselves, but to their families, to their prospects for a better life, and to the well-being of our entire state. Education is still one of the most important contributors to economic mobility. With a bachelor's degree, one can expect to earn nearly $1 million more over their lifetime than someone with only a high school diploma, and that wage gap is continuing to widen. Our goal is to ensure that all young people get a fair shot at higher education and a better life. It's a goal we share with California Competes, and it is one that we cannot accomplish alone. That's why my foundation works with organizations and leaders across the state to catalyze systemic change so that the vision of a seamless, student-centered educational path to opportunity becomes the reality for California's diverse students. As a University of California regent, a trustee of the California State University, and chair of the Commission for Economic Development, the Lieutenant Governor is best positioned to advance real change for our students and for the state of California as a whole. We're thrilled that you're here with us tonight, and we hope that we all walk away with a better understanding of how our candidates, former U.S. Ambassador to Hungary, Eleni Kounalakis, and California State Senator Dr. Ed Hernandez, will approach policymaking around critical issues like equity, college completion, affordability, and higher education finance. I urge you to read more about the candidates in your program. But in addition to the candidates, the program will feature California Competes Executive Director, Dr. Lande Ajose. California Competes' mission is to support bold yet pragmatic policy recommendations to equitably boost California's post-secondary degree attainment and fuel the state's economy. We have long supported the work of California Competes and value the organization's contributions to higher education, policy, and research. Dr. Ajose is an expert in urban labor markets and higher education policy. Her work in higher education began as an admissions officer at Vassar College, and afterwards she has spent many years working in higher ed research and philanthropy with a focus on equity and student success. In 2014, Governor Jerry Brown appointed her to the California Student Aid Commission, which she currently serves as its chair. Dr. Ajose will engage in a rich discussion with each candidate for about 25 minutes. Each conversation will then be followed by a 10 to 15-minute question and answer session led by CALmatters higher education reporter Felicia Mello. CALmatters is a nonpartisan, nonprofit journalism venture committed to meaningfully inform Californians about the players, the politics, and the interests that shape and affect our lives. The College Futures Foundation is proud to support the very important work of this organization as well. Ms. Mello is an award-winning multimedia journalist who's contributed stories to the Washington Post, The Nation, NPR, and CNN's Parts Unknown, among others. A Bay Area native, she earned her master's degree in journalism from UC Berkeley. So with that, everyone, thank you for joining us, and please welcome Dr. Lande Ajose.
Thank you, Monica. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I like it when people talk back to me, so you're going to have to. Thank you so much for coming. It's lovely to have you all here with us tonight. I really want to thank those of you who braved the Dreamforce traffic to make it to the Commonwealth Club, and I also want to thank everyone who's watching this via live stream from across the state. Before we get started, I have to start by thanking the College Futures Foundation. For many years now, from California Compete's perspective, they have been our partners. They have exhibited their leadership in higher education. They have been steadfast in supporting California Compete, and they are actually helping to co-sponsor this event tonight. So I wanted to say thank you very much to the foundation. I also want to welcome a few special guests that we have. Welcome to the Higher Education Equity Coalition, who are here in force. Thank you for your partnership. We'd like to welcome our funders, who are also here with us tonight. And we also want to make sure we welcome the students who have come from across the bridge and across the bay and across town, because at the end of the day, all of the work that we do is about their experience and making sure that we maximize the student experience. So thank you for that. I would be remiss if I didn't also take a moment to thank members of the California Competes Leadership Council and also the College Futures Board who have joined us: Lenny Mendonca, Julia Lopez, Carol Liu, and of course, Donna Lucas. As Monica mentioned, California Competes conducts bold and pragmatic research to try and advance higher education's challenges, and we're really kind of keenly focused on the issue of the degree and certificate attainment shortage. Our research shows that California needs at least 55% of adults with a post-secondary degree or credential to maintain our state's strong economic standing. We're well behind this figure, which translates to a gap of roughly 2 million degrees and sub-baccalaureate credentials by 2025. And we simply aren't doing enough fast enough to close that gap. We exist to help meet that challenge. We undertake higher education policy, research, and advocacy work that's focused on a double bottom line. First, we're very committed to achieving equity in California's diverse student population so that they all have access to higher education. And we're also committed to ensuring that California's higher education graduates fuel the state's very rich and robust regional economies. Tonight's program is intended to shed a light on those two twin goals. And now for a few details for the evening. California Competes is a fiscally sponsored project of Community Partners, a 501c3 organization. And as such, like the College Futures Foundation, we neither endorse nor oppose any candidates for public office. The order of the evening's events will be a set of sequential conversations determined during our Leadership Council meeting on September 7th by coin toss. As a result of that coin toss, it has been determined that I will first sit down with Senator Dr. Ed Hernandez. To be fair, Ambassador Eleni Kounalakis is currently waiting in the green room and will join us once we conclude our first conversation. Each candidate conversation will cover the same broad topics in higher education. In the interest of fairness, the exact questions for each candidate were randomly selected. I'd like to ask those of you here in the audience with us to please refrain from applause until the end of our conversation. And we'd also like to ask the candidates to please refrain from referring to one another during our conversations. Since Ambassador Kounalakis is in the green room, I'll repeat this request once more when she arrives. Finally, I want to remind folks that we are live streaming on Facebook, so if you could please silence your cell phones during the period of the conversations, that would be very helpful. Dr. Ed Hernandez is a California state senator having represented District 22 in the San Gabriel Valley since 2010. He is currently a member of the Senate Committees on Health, Business Professions and Economic Development, and Insurance. He has also served in the State Assembly from 2006 to 2010 and has had a long career as a practicing optometrist in his hometown of La Puente. I also should mention he really liked my glasses. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ed Hernandez. Thank you so much for joining us. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. We've been planning this for a long time.
I love
so
your
I'm
shoes
so
too as well.
Well, thank you. I was hoping someone would note the shoes. So we're so excited to have you. We have been planning this for a long time. When we were thinking about this year and the election that's happening in 2018, we said, no one focuses on the lieutenant governor, and actually they play a really important role in higher education. So we're so thrilled that you would agree to be here in conversation with us
It's
tonight.
my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We wanted to start by hearing your college
Sure.
story. I think that everyone who goes to college has a story of how they got there
All right.
and what that was like. So maybe you could tell us yours.
Sure. So right shortly after high school, I will tell you, it's hard to believe this, but I had lots of attitude and had no direction in life. And I'll be honest with you, I had no idea what I was going to do. But something very special happened to me. I became a teen parent, and the light bulb turned on. Because I realized that I had a responsibility, and I needed to do something with my life. And that's when I kicked myself into gear. But it wasn't easy. I didn't have the financial resources to go to school, so I did it the hard way. And I did it through 3 years of community college, but that entire time, I was working pretty much 35 hours a week to be able to not only put myself through school, but to support my daughter. And I did what most students did, Cal grants, student loans. And then I transferred to the Cal State system. So why the Cal State system? It was less expensive than the UC system. I chose Cal State Fullerton. How many of you here from Southern California? How many from Cal State Fullerton? Oh, we got some Titans in the room. Go. Cal State Fullerton. Now, where I live in proximity to Cal State Fullerton, I could have gone to Cal State LA, but here's the deciding factor. It was going against traffic. Because I can get to school, but it was also in close proximity to where I worked. And sure enough, after 3 years of Cal State Fullerton, I was able to graduate with a degree in biology. And I wanted to become an optometrist. But, there wasn't a lot of role models for me, but there was one very, very special person who used to go to work in the morning with a clinic coat, unlike my dad, who went to work with blue jeans and work boots. And it was my mom. She was a receptionist for an optometrist.
Wow.
And she got me a job working on Saturdays, answering the phones. I said, this is kind of cool. I think I want to do this. I want to be an optometrist. And was fortunate enough to get a full scholarship to Indiana University, where I met my beautiful wife, Diane, who's also an optometrist. And I says, I love you, but I'm not staying in Indiana for the rest of my life. I have a child. We wanted to come home and make a life of ourselves. We went back and opened up our practice. But I will tell you that, to me, an education, first of all, a public education is the cornerstone to democracy in this country. But a higher education is the absolute greatest equalizer. Because where else can somebody like me from such modest means, my dad worked in a factory. My mom was a receptionist, and pulled myself up and got through school to not only become an optometrist, by the way, first in my family to graduate from college, open up a practice in the community I grew up in and give back, run for the state legislature, become a state senator, and hopefully someday maybe become the next lieutenant governor. But where else in this incredible country we call United States, but it's particularly in California? So that's why I think that education is just this incredible opportunity, because we have an opportunity to change the delta in this state.
Yeah.
The future of the state of California and the economic empowerment is through higher education. And Monica made a comment about the number of minorities that are going through school, we need to figure out how we're going to get them through so we can have future Bill Gates of the world, we can have doctors, lawyers. That is the future of the state of California. And I think that's my story.
Yeah, thank you for that story. And it's everyone has their higher education story. I'm wondering if you could tell us, given that, what are your top three priorities for higher education when you think about what this state needs?
Well, obviously access, but more importantly, cost and affordability. But besides the access and the affordability, the ability for kids, more importantly, kids of communities of color to be able to get through, and not only get through, but to graduate. You know, if you look at the statistics of the number of kids that are graduating from high school, these are higher numbers than we've ever had in the history of the state of California. Those are my goals. But what I would like to tell you, what I like to do as Lieutenant Governor is to address the master plan of the state of California. The last time we did that was in the 1960s. The 1960s is not California of today. The master plan of the 1960s, as you know, it was never put in the statute. It talked about college affordability, which it's not. You know, it talked about creating an education facilities for all of the kids that were going through. We have much different population, double in size. We have much different circumstances and a lot of different challenges that we have to look at to be able to address those.
Yeah. You mentioned the different population, and it reminds me of something you said earlier, which is that California and higher education is fundamentally a ladder for economic opportunity. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what that means, what equity means in the context of higher ed. You know, we in California live in the 5th largest economy in the world, and we are also in the largest and fastest growing income inequality in the nation. And so, you know, when you think about a college degree as an engine for economic mobility, we know that that's not a resource that's evenly distributed, right, or equitably distributed. Right. What could we be doing as a state to better address the equity challenges related to higher ed?
Well, first of all, what we have to do is prioritize higher education. Don't get me wrong, I think this governor has done an incredible job, but just for example, the coordinating committee or the coordinating body that we wanted to put together was constantly taken out of the budget, okay? If I become the next lieutenant governor, my priority would be to talk to the new administration and make sure that we prioritize higher education. But also, earlier what I was talking about is how do we get these young, bright individuals to be able to get through school? But we also have to look at how we educate. We currently have 3 systems: the community college system, the Cal State University system, and the UC system. But I really believe that we educate in silos. And a lot of those silos aren't talking to each other. So I think the next thing we have to do is look at how we're going to share data amongst those various systems and how do they work together. Maybe we should have a conversation from community college to CSU and how are we going to get more young adults to be able to get in and get out.
Now, well, I have questions on that.
Okay, all right.
Know that we will get back there.
So I'm sorry I jumped the gun. Sorry.
No, we are big into the data commitment, so I do want to probe that a little bit more. You know, one of the challenges that you already mentioned in terms of folks moving through higher education has to do with affordability. And I know when I am across the state talking with students, talking with electeds, affordability is almost always the first thing that folks mention. In recent years, there's been a lot of discussion about the total cost of attendance, that, you know, we are very fortunate to have some resources to help cover tuition costs in the state and fees, but housing, food, transportation, those are issues that aren't covered by our Cal Grant program, and that it's very difficult for students to cover in their budgets. What do you think the state should be doing to think about covering the total cost of attendance for students?
And exactly what you said, you hit the nail on the head. We have to look at the total cost. Let me go back again to the master plan, and the population of the 60s is so much different, and the needs and the challenges of young adults today is vast. You know, I've been fortunate serving in the California legislature. We talk about free tuition. You know, I was one of the principal co-authors with Assemblymember Santiago to have the first year of community college. But the conversation has to be much bigger than that. Transportation, housing. Look at the students of today share the same concerns that society has as a whole. Food insecurity. There are some real problems with students today that have food insecurity. We need to talk about how we get the campuses to have even food pantries. I mean, I can remember in grad school, I mean, not because I wanted to drink, but I used to go to all the happy hours because that's where I had my meals. So, I did. And, fortunately, when I met my future wife, she was a resident assistant, and it was a feast when I get invited to the cafeteria. But these are challenges that kids are going through today. But here's what else they're challenging with. Homelessness. I read that article. How many of you read that article in the LA Times about that young, bright student at UC Berkeley that's living in a car? These are things we have to address. Mental health issues, substance abuse. We're not talking about that. The whole person and the whole student needs to be addressed, and it's not just tuition.
Right.
That's the key to success.
So let me ask you, given all of those priorities and all those competing priorities, if the next governor said to you, $500 million that I want to allocate towards higher education, what would you recommend to him that he do to carve that money up? What would that look like? How would you prioritize those things?
So I think it's got to be more than $500 million. And no, I mean, it does. It does. And that's maybe where the conversation should start. But let me tell you, serving in the California legislature last 12 years, I can guarantee one thing's going to happen. We're going to have another economic recession. And whenever there's an economic recession, Carol knows this because her and I served in the legislature when we had the last one. Guess what gets cut first? Because there's no protection. Higher education, health and human services. I had to vote on some of the most horrific cuts that I didn't want to vote on. We have to have a much bigger conversation, number one, about having a steady revenue source in our general fund as well. But there needs to be another conversation. Because higher education is so important in the future of the state, we have to have a conversation. How do we generate revenue outside of the general fund that's not subject to the ebbs and flows of the economies and bad economic times?
So what would that look like?
A commission that looks at how do we address and talk to the community, the public, because I can tell you this, if the public is convinced that we will use money in the right way, like, for example, transportation, Measure R in LA County, the public will pay for it. But it could or will probably be in the form of either some kind of tax increase, property tax assessment, a bond. But this is an investment in the future of the state of California, but it's money that's protected for the future of the state of California to deal with all those issues that we're talking about.
So one of the challenges I think that the higher education institutions face is that they have to plan their budgets on an annual basis, when in fact they don't educate students on an annual basis. Students are there for 2 years or 4 years. Talk to me about what multi-year budgeting should look like for our institutions if we really want to think about alternate revenue sources and how to really help institutions plan for the long term rather than managing to the immediate term.
So the unfortunate fact is that in the state legislature, we budget on a year-to-year budget from June to June. But I think what we need to do is think outside the box. You'd made comments about bold statements of how we're going to completely revolutionize the educational system. First of all, we need to think strategically. Here's the other thing I learned being in the legislature. We seem to legislate reactively. God forbid if there is a shooting, a mass shooting, the next day every legislator introduces a ban on assault weapons or ammunition. What we need to do is strategically come together, all the parties, but more importantly, all the stakeholders, and strategically look at how we're going to fund the future of the 21st century in the state of California. Take all those dollars, incorporate that into the general budget, and then make sure it's protected so that we can move forward.
We're talking about the institutions, and in addition to funding the institutions, one of the concerns that we often hear from the institutions are constraints in terms of capacity. And we know that there are many more students in this state who would like to attend a UC or a CSU or even get their courses at a community college than we have the capacity to hold. So I'm wondering how you would use your role as Lieutenant Governor to increase access when colleges seem maxed out on enrollment.
Right. So again, number one, working with the administration, sitting on two of the biggest boards, where the regents, the CSU Board of Trustees, talking with the community colleges, again, going back to the strategic discussion that we would have, and this is not going to happen overnight. It could, and if I get lucky enough, could take 2, 3, 4, and maybe even 8 years of the time that I'd be Lieutenant Governor to work with not only the administration, but the legislature as well. I'll give you an example. 2 days ago, I called Senator Steve Glazier, who has a select committee on higher education. Wanted to find out what work he's doing. Talked to Assemblymember Mark Berman, who had 4 committee hearings on the strategic, on our master plan of the state of California. The experience that I've had these last 12 years and the relationships I've built with these members is to continue to do that work and then do that work to figure out how we're going to move forward in the state of California.
One of the topics at one of Assemblyman Berman's master plan hearings was focused on college completion.
Right.
And I think, we have made a promise in this state, initiated through the master plan to have a spot for everyone.
Right.
We have not made the same promise in this state to ensure that everyone actually completes their degree. 80% of CSU grads take more than 4 years to complete, and about half of community college students transfer within 5 years. Can you talk about that length of time
Sure.
actually extends the
Right.
state's cost, right? So there's a cost implication. Can you talk about how, as Lieutenant Governor, you would support improving time to degree, on-time
Sure.
transfers, and timely college completion?
Number one, reducing barriers is the highest priority, like we did the college entrance exam. But I would also take a tack like we've done for K through 12, local control funding. The local control funding, you have the pot of money, but there's money that's allocated in a higher percentage to free and reduced, to kids with foster kids, as well as English learners. Because you're going to put the resources, number one, into the areas that have the greatest need. You had talked about the number of communities of color, the number of middle class, low-income students that are transferring to community college but not making it all the way through. When we look strategically at the entire state, yes, you're going to look at the total resources. Does that mean building new Cs, building new CSUs? But if we put the resources to get those young adults in through the system, but to graduate, what does it mean? Does it mean more nurses? Does it mean the ability for them to help them out with their college as far as paying for transportation, childcare, homelessness, mental health issues? This is what I think we need to do, is look at it holistically.
So when you think, going back to the question about the $500 million,
Right.
I know it's not enough,
Right.
but where do those concerns kind of sit relative to housing,
Right.
food, other
And that's why I think you have to look at it holistically, but more important, the priority of the money needs to be for those individuals that needs it the most. If you come from a family that has a significant amount of resources, yes, they can afford. But the other thing too, maybe there's something else that I think we haven't talked about, is the parents of these students. How do you get those parents to teach them to get their kids to go to college? I'll give you an example. My mom, my entire life, I just heard her tell me, she'd say, "Mijo," which means son in Spanish, "I want you to go to college." Well, my mom didn't know what that meant, and she just knew that a college education was a better life for me than what she had. So I remember the first time I went to community college, I took a psychology course. I was sitting at the dinner table, I go, "Mom, I'm taking psychology." She says, "¿Qué es eso?" What's that? She didn't know. My children are fortunate because my children were expected to go to college. They took AP courses, they took IB courses, SAT, because my wife and I, have the resources. I don't need help. Now that I'm situated, my children don't need help. They are going to be successful because we're going to give them the resources. We need to have a conversation to give the resources for those families who don't know how to put their kids through college. That's the future of the state of California. We need to build a middle class, and it's done through the economic empowerment of kids like that need help.
So our CalGrant program, when you think about that, it really provides tuition and fees for students. It doesn't think about beyond tuition and fees, who needs more, who needs less. Is my family earning $40,000 a year? Is my family earning $65,000 a year? Would you advocate changes to the CalGrant program to address some of those differential needs?
We have an incredible CalGrant program that does help with tuition, but we don't have the conversation of the cost of education. Are we not talking about having more counselors? Why aren't we talking about having social services, like counselors that'll help in mental health issues and homelessness issues? We need to start thinking differently, and we have to be bold to think outside of the box to change the delta of the state of California, because the future of our state depends on our educational workforce.
I want to spend a little time talking about coordination, because it's kind of at the heart of how California's higher education system was designed. There are ways in which I think our higher education institutions are quite independent from one another. And then there are ways that they're interdependent or designed to be so. What's your sense of how the UC, the CSU, and the community college systems how well aligned they are and where they may not be aligned and what may or may not be working in terms of how they are all
Right.
getting along.
So I'm going to use the analogy in healthcare where we educate in silos, where you have allopathic physicians educated a certain way, you have nurses educated a certain way, but at the end of the day, and I think you made the comment about instead of patient-centric, how we're creating and treating patients, it's student-centric. And I think what we're doing is, not that I'm trying to say that the UC system is different or better than the CSU system, because the CSU system graduates the most undergraduate degrees in the state, but we need to think about student-centric and how does the system get kids through school, and how do we prioritize that? And that's, I think, where the conversation needs to go. Again, going back to the master plan, we have a master plan of a system that was created in the 60s. This is the system of the 21st century that we now have to start thinking differently.
Let me ask a little bit about this particular role of lieutenant governor. As you mentioned earlier, the lieutenant governor sits on the UC Regents, CSU Board of Trustees, and also chairs the Commission for Economic Development for the state. I'm thinking about the workforce needs that we have in the state, and I'm wondering where you see opportunities for alignment or how you would use that seat, that opportunity to be lieutenant governor to bring greater alignment across those systems and institutions.
Sure. So first of all, I think I will have the ability, coming off 12 years of the legislature, and one thing I've learned serving, this is a very simple profession. It's all about relationships. Whether it's the relationship with the pro tem, the speaker, Senator Glazier, Assemblymember Berman, to use those relationships to do the work that I'd like to do, which is strategically think of how we're going to change the system. But you had mentioned the economic empowerment of the state and the Economic Development Commission. But guess what? We have to look at how we educate the entire population. And it may be not just college degrees, which is a very, very important thing which we have to get to. Yes, STEM is important. But what about the building trades? What about certification? What about plumbing? What about electrical workers? Think about the housing crisis we have right now and the workforce that we don't have to build a number of houses. Our housing prices are going up just because we don't have enough units. So as we think strategically of how we're going to educate the entire population, even think of an auto mechanic. An auto mechanic today is not like an auto mechanic of the past. They're dealing with computers, they're dealing with math, so there's a lot more different skills that we have to look at, and I think that's where it's going to come in. And I think as Lieutenant Governor, you're going to be chair of the Economic Development Commission, interacting with Silicon Valley, interacting with businesses, and also trying to bring more business in the state of California to say, look, we have a real story to be told here in the state of California, the 5th largest economy in the world. There's still more people coming here that are leaving. We are busting at the seams. We still have more venture capital money than any other state. This is a great story to be told, and California is a great story to live, but we have to make sure that we have an educational system that adds to that.
So if you're elected lieutenant governor, what would you want to say your most significant accomplishment has been? What would you want your lieutenant governor legacy to look like?
So if I become lieutenant governor, I'd be in this incredible honor, because I'll tell you, serving in the California state legislature and being a public servant has just been just this incredible experience. I hope that should I become lieutenant governor, and when I'm done, that individuals would say, you know what, Ed Hernandez made higher education a priority, made a difference, and made a difference in young kids' lives and helped change the delta of the state. Just like I've done this last 12 years as chair of the Senate Health Committee. And I would challenge you can ask anybody the mark that I made not only in the legislature, but the mark that I made in the state and this country in changing the healthcare system in the state. And that's how I attack issues. That's how I go in and work. And I want to have that same kind of legacy, and I'd be honored to have that legacy.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for taking the time. I'm actually going to invite Felicia Mello from CalMatters to spend another 10 or 15 minutes with the questions she's prepared.
Sure.
And I'll invite her up to the stage. So, Felicia.
Hello.
Excuse
It happens. I'll give you a moment.
That was at the worst time. Okay, I think I'm ready.
It's been that kind of day. My car broke down on the way to the
Right.
event, so it's been a day of mishaps.
Well, my car didn't break down on the way here. I was
There you go.
afraid we were going to get stuck in traffic and get late, but we made it with plenty of time. So anyway, I'm ready.
So I'll jump right in. So we have solicited questions from students and other stakeholders. And in talking to students, I, as a reporter, was struck by how often the issue of mental health came up. So I want to get into that a little bit more. We already touched on it. Students are increasingly reporting depression and anxiety, that the counseling appointments aren't there for them when they need those services. This week, Governor Brown vetoed a bill this past week that would have established minimum staffing levels in counseling centers on college campuses. It would be lovely to see that $500 million coming down the pike. I'm sure a lot of folks in the audience would like that. Looking at where we are now, what's the next thing that should be done to address mental health needs on college campuses?
So what I mentioned is the needs of the students mirror the needs of society, and mental health is a huge problem. We have a couple problems. Number one, we're not connecting mental health with physical health, which I think needs to be done. We have another huge problem. We don't have enough mental health providers in the state. We have a workforce shortage. And that's obviously what we're talking about, is creating a workforce of the future. We have a provider shortage. If you think about the mental health, we have psychiatrists who, to today, are not taking private insurance. Guess what they're doing? They're taking private pay in affluent communities. So these things strategically we need to kind of look at. Now, the good thing is with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, we do have mental health services as one of the 10 essential health benefits. But going back to what I'm talking about strategically, how do we make sure that what we need in society translates to what students need of today, because it's one and the same. And yes, we need to look at that, but there is a lot of work, and I'm hoping that our university system could be able to address that.
You've obviously become known as an advocate on healthcare in your time in the legislature. You have not sat on any of the education-related committees or authored and passed major higher education-related legislation. Why should Californians trust you to lead on this issue?
Well, because Carol Lou didn't want me sitting on their committee. I'm just giving you a hard time, Carol. Actually, I have taken on some tough issues in education. Yes, I've been chair of the Senate Health Committee for the last 8 years. Yes, that's a passion of mine because I'm an optometrist, and that's why I ran. But I also told you the story earlier that I believe that education is the greatest equalizer. I've taken up some tough issues that unfortunately haven't been able to get through the governor's desk or even get two to get a signature. For example, I did two statutory changes to try to change and repeal Proposition 209. One was put on Governor Schwarzenegger's desk, and one was put on Jerry Brown's desk. Both got vetoed. I did two constitutional amendments. Constitutional amendments need a 2/3 majority to get through, and I got the last one almost through, and there was a firestorm, and I got beat up politically, and unfortunately didn't get through.
Do you think the time is ripe to raise that issue again, and would you as Lieutenant Governor if you were elected?
I've always been willing to raise that issue because I really believe that if you look at the number of communities of color, post-209 has really changed dramatically. We need to have a conversation about race. I'm not saying it's, you're going to get accepted, but it needs to be part of the discussion. We have a lot of ugliness going on in this country right now where there's a lot of division, especially amongst race, and that's the conversation we should have. But I'll give you an example of some other things I've done legislatively. Unfortunately, again, because it costs money, that it was always at the, I got stopped. I want to share a story with you. It was shortly after I got elected to the Assembly. I used to see patients on my legislative break, and every time I get a young person in the exam chair, I always ask them, what college are you going to go to? Because I want to encourage them to go to school. So this young man, I says, what's your dream college? And he said, I want to go to UCLA. Great. How many AP courses have you taken? He said, well, I haven't taken that many. I go, well, why not? Because my high school doesn't offer it. And I thought that wasn't true. So I went back to my staff. Do you realize that there's, I think, over 130 high schools in the state of California that offer very little to no AP courses? Okay. To get accepted to the University of California, state of California, you can use 4 AP courses towards your GPA. How, and guess where the majority of those high schools are? Poor, inner city, and rural communities. How is that bright kid from East LA, Compton, Central Valley, how is that bright kid going to compete to get into a UC system if their GPA can't match that of somebody who has 4 AP courses? So a bill I introduced was to require every high school in the state of California to offer a minimum of 4 AP courses. And guess why it was vetoed? The cost. So yes, I have taken on issues, and I'm not afraid to take on tough issues, but these are the conversations we have to have. But there's an equity gap with kids who don't have the same resources as to kids who have the resources.
We talked about the master plan. Both you and your opponent have said that you would oppose tuition increases as lieutenant governor, future increases. Do you think we should go back to the days of no tuition, except for some nominal fees at UC and CSU?
Well, I think we need to have a conversation about total cost of education. Yes, it would be nice to have no cost, but I still think the conversation needs to start with how are we going to pay for it? It's easy to say everything's going to be free, but how do we prioritize? And I think strategically we have to talk about how do we look at the system, how do we address the master plan, and how do we address the master plan to be able to afford to have kids to have no cost. But if you have limited resources, I still believe, like we did in local control funding, that priority should shift to the kids that need it the most.
Are there specific changes that you think we need to be making to the master plan to our overall vision?
Yeah, I think we need to address affordability. We need to afford access, which is not. The original master plan talks about an incredible education system. We have one, but it's not attainable to everybody. The master plan should address the coordinating body that we don't have or should be funded. The master plan should talk about sharing data and having an integrated system. The master plan should talk about, instead of patient-centric, it should talk about, kid-centric or educational-centric. We need to start looking at how we're going to educate the future of the state of California. And the master plan needs to look a lot different because the master plan, the California of today is 40 million. It's more diverse. It's a much different state than it was in the 1960s.
I'm going to go now to a question from a student. This question comes from Brianna Ramos, a transfer student at Sac State studying criminal justice. And she says that finding the right fit for campus presidents is really important because the attitudes and the priorities of a president really set precedent that trickles down to the staff and the whole atmosphere on campus. And she wanted to know if you are elected and sit on the board of trustees, what qualities would you look for in choosing campus leaders?
So I think let's go a step further. It shouldn't just be campus leaders like campus presidents. It should be faculty as well. We are talking about young adults going into college. We're talking about diversifying the educational workforce or the educational of the university system. But we also should be talking about the workforce of the future should reflect the demographics of the state. Well, guess what? So should the campuses. I think the campuses, the campus presidents, and the professors should reflect the demographics of the state.
With a lot of that hiring in the hands of faculty committees, what can be done from the level of the Board of Regents, Board of Trustees to make that happen?
So I was going to take the next step because it shouldn't be just at that level. It should be at the highest level. Let's talk about the Board of Regents and the CSU Board of Trustees. These are all gubernatorial appointments that are ratified by the Senate. We need to have a conversation at the nomination process to say, okay, those individuals should reflect the value of who we are as students. I'll give you another example of a piece of legislation I put through. I'm not having much luck with educational. It didn't get through. But I proposed a constitutional amendment that would change the makeup of the UC Board of Regents. It would have taken away 2 and it added 2 students. It would have taken away 2, added 2 faculty. It would have taken away 2 and add 2 classifieds. Now you're diversifying, but it also what would have done, it would have made the community college individual, the president, a permanent board member on the UC Board of Regents. Now he is now, just because he already happened to be. But it also shortened the terms so that if the individuals aren't doing what the jobs that they're doing, they would allow the legislative process, the gubernatorial process, to be able to look at making some changes. Okay, think about this. If I become lieutenant governor, I would serve for 8 years. The average regent, when they get appointed, they're a 12-year appointee.
Let's talk about housing. So we received a number of questions about housing, as you can imagine. One UCLA student was a commuter student like you, said, I live at home and commute over 25 miles instead of paying $15,000 a year to live in a dorm, or at least $1,000 a month for rent. And I think what she's pointing to is that, you often hear students kind of paint two kinds of scenarios. One is there's literally not any housing. I can't find any. And another is there's a dorm bed available to me, but I can't afford that dorm bed. And so a number of the students who posed this question want to know specifically when you're dealing with housing that's being built by public-private partnerships or housing that's built by private companies in the area of a campus, what can be done to ensure that those units are actually affordable on a student budget?
Well, again, going back to the total cost of education, and yes, I understand because I have my youngest daughter who graduated from UCLA. We paid that amount of money to have 3 young ladies in the room that was the size of a closet. It just seems like it's getting more and more difficult. So I really believe that if you're going to have any kind of housing subsidy like that, then the legislature, through the legislative process, we should look at either having some kind of tax breaks. But more importantly, if you're going to have some type of incentive to allow some development, then in return there has to be affordable housing, especially for students. Because otherwise, if you don't, then you're not going to have the ability to have some low income or affordable housing.
Last question. As you think about your advocacy on higher education, do you have any role models in that area?
In higher education?
Mm-hmm.
It'd have to be my mom, just because she's the one that encouraged me to go to college. Fortunately, both my parents are still alive, and she just beams at the fact of what I've accomplished, and I think she believes I've done that through an education. And for me, it's just got to be my parents.
What's the lesson there?
The lesson is to look up to your parents and behave. Tell that to my children.
On that note.
On that note, we wanted to say thank you to
Thank
Senator
you.
Hernandez for joining us tonight.
It's been an absolute
Thank you so
pleasure.
much.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. So. Great, after you.
And thank you to Felicia for those very insightful comments. We'll make sure to invite her back to the stage again in a few moments. Great. Before we move to section 2, I want to start by repeating the something I said earlier in the program, which is we'd like to ask the candidates to please refrain from directly referencing one another during our conversations. And you've been a very good audience, so I know you won't do it, but we'd like to ask those of you in the audience to also refrain from applause until the end of our conversation. It is now my distinct pleasure to welcome our next candidate to join us for the remainder of the program. Eleni Kounalakis is a California businesswoman and the former ambassador to Hungary under President Barack Obama. She served on California's First Five Commission and the California Blue Ribbon Commission on Autism. She was appointed by Mayor Ed Lee to the San Francisco Port Commission, and she currently chairs the California Advisory Council for International Trade and Investment. Welcome, candidate for Lieutenant Governor, Eleni Kounalakis.
Thank you. Thank you, Lande. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Nice to
Thank you.
How are you?
I am well. How are you?
I'm good.
Great. It's wonderful to be here in a big crowd and lots of people I recognize as being very involved in higher education. So
Very
I'm
exciting.
honored.
We are excited to have so many people who care about higher education turn out again in the middle of Dreamforce. So thank you all for coming. I actually want to start as I mentioned, when folks grow up in the state of California, most of us have a story. And almost all of us who have the opportunity to go to college have a college story. So can you start by just telling us a little bit about what's your college story?
Sure. Well, I've been very fortunate with educational opportunities in my life. And I very often think about my grandmother because everyone says that I'm like her. She was a Spitfire. She was small. She was tough, relentless. But she never went to school, not for a single day. And she could not read or write. She found other ways to communicate. She would write up poems, and there was a tradition of storytelling, but she couldn't read. And she let my father come to the United States. He came when he was just 14 years old. He worked in the fields of California as a farm worker, made his way to Sacramento State, where he got an education. He didn't graduate, but he got an education. I went off to college, the first in my family to go off to a 4-year university. And then from there went on to graduate school at UC Berkeley. And, when I was 43 years old, I was sworn in as a United States ambassador. My grandmother could never have imagined that her granddaughter could have an opportunity like that. And for me and for my family, it all went through the hallways of higher education, particularly, by the way, my father's, because to go from the fields to the classroom is a pretty significant change and really representative of the values of California, which is that we don't know where talent is going to come from. So you throw open the doors of opportunity to all who seek the virtues of higher education, and talent will spring up. He paid $62 a semester back then, including books. It was back when you could work your way through college. So it wasn't assured that I would go off to college, but I had other role models around me, and I knew that I wanted to learn as much as I could and maybe one day be a teacher, and ended up in college and pursuing my own piece of the American dream.
That's great. So when you think about that experience, tell me what for you would be your highest priorities for higher education if you were elected lieutenant governor.
Well, Lande, my highest priority is number one, that we have to make higher education affordable again for California students. My father paid $62 a semester for Sac State. I paid $2,000 a year for my master's degree at Berkeley. That program today is $62,000 a year. Now, I'm not that old, So there has been a massive shift where we have gone from funding higher education out of the general fund to putting a very large burden on the shoulders of our students. And it is really creating less opportunity to throw open the doors and see what talent will rise up. So that's number one. But number two is we have a real capacity problem in the CSU and the UCs right now. We have more students who are qualified to go to the CSUs and UCs than are getting accepted. In fact, last year, the California State University system had to reject about 32,000 qualified applicants. So that to me is just an absolute disaster for us because they're there, they're educated, they're qualified, they're ready to go, and we don't have room for them. But at the same time, we are facing a looming skills gap where we need in California to be able to continue to grow our economy. We need more students to have higher education degrees. So really it's bringing down the cost to California kids, increasing capacity, and then also, and this is a little bit different part of my personal experience, the fact that I served as a United States ambassador, and I've spent a great deal of time around the world seeing how other countries grapple with that education economy equation. And the fact of the matter is that we're also facing rapid changes to the way our economy is working. And if we do not have enough flexibility, if we are not nimble enough within our higher education systems, we may be educating students, but not necessarily with the tools that they're going to need to be able to succeed in the changing economy.
So when you think about affordability, capacity issues, and the workforce challenges, and you think about the role of being lieutenant governor, one of our audience members wanted to know, what do you think your greatest obstacle might be as lieutenant governor in enacting or advancing improvements in those three areas for higher education, and how would you address those obstacles or challenges?
Well, one of the things that everybody says is the lieutenant governor doesn't do anything, right? And the fact of the matter is that to me, this job really should be defined by the role that you play in higher education, because you sit on two of the three public higher education boards. We are a state of 40 million people. 3 out of 4 students graduating or going through school right now, higher education, are in public education system. So to me, you can make a full-time job of being lieutenant governor out of the work and what you can contribute, both not just because you sit on one, but because you sit on 2 of the boards. Also because you have staff, and I intend to commit a very significant portion of my staff, if I'm elected, to work on higher education. But then also, everybody always says, well, it's a bully pulpit. Well, what better way to use the bully pulpit than in a way that actually corresponds to your statutory responsibilities for this job?
You mentioned the public systems, and one of the systems that we often don't pay a lot of attention to, or one of the opportunities in California, are our private institutions. I'm wondering how the bully pulpit could be used, or the role of the office of Lieutenant Governor to address how the private institutions, the nonprofits, the independents in our state, can also help to address the kinds of challenges that you've outlined.
Well, okay, that's an interesting question. I will tell you, more focused on public system, but the private side, we have to look at that as well, because even though it's just 1 out of 4 of our students attending those, when you've got as many people as we have, that's a good chunk of our students. And I think that by and large, the private institutions, the largest I think is USC, obviously Stanford is an extraordinary research university, but I actually think that the area where I'm really most focused is what's going on in these career and technical education colleges that provide higher education, but where students who end up in them tend to borrow a lot more than if they go to a community college. And what we're also finding with those private career and technical education universities is that students of color tend to be the ones who gravitate there and end up, again, with higher levels of debt. So I guess the way I think about the private career and technical education sector is I would like to steal as many students away from them and put them in community colleges where they can go for a much more affordable price. In fact, many are able to go for no tuition or fees at all.
I bet Chancellor Oakley would agree with you on that. It's interesting because I think the reason that you have so many students who gravitate towards those private for-profit institutions is because there's a promise at the end of the day that there's a job. There's a promise for some kind of economic mobility, and we know that that promise is not always realized. But when we think about some of the public institutions, we also know that if we look at the data, there are stark differences in completion rates, in graduation rates. Those often break down by gender, by race, and by ethnicity. What do we do about trying to make higher education much more equitable?
Well, this is absolutely one of the things we have to be looking at. And the reason that I always start with capacity is because there are so many students who are waiting, ready, trained, qualified, and want to go, particularly into the CSU schools right now, and there's no space for them. So the lowest hanging fruit to deal with equity is make sure that we have a place for every student who is qualified, applying, and wants to go. Secondly, we have to look at the CalGrant program, because what we're seeing is the creation of this sort of donut hole effect where students who can afford to go are going. Students who qualify at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of their household income are going to get the support to be able to go. Middle-class families are really struggling to be able to afford to go. And that cuts across all of the representation barriers. So expansion of CalGrants is something that I think we have to look at as well. But there is a happy story on the question of how we're going to fill this achievement gap. And that is that for the last 7 years, every year, one after the other, sequentially, more students than ever are graduating from high school. So I think it's really important to recognize that as much as we struggle with K-12 education, every year we've got greater percentage of students, particularly typically underrepresented students in higher education, who are coming out of the high school. So that's really important. And I think the other side of the equation, and again, if you've seen economies elsewhere in the world, you don't have this opportunity where we know we are going to need somewhere around 1 million more students with degrees in higher education to fill the need of the future. All we have to do is get them through this pipeline. Now, it's easier said than done, but the fact that you've got the students and you've got the jobs waiting, this is the opportunity that exists. The fact that you have the students who want it as well is so important. And then I think that the other piece of this that it's important to remember is that our general fund for so long was a much higher percentage that we would invest. And we have data. UC Berkeley just released a study not too long ago. We have data about investing in higher education and what we get from it. And according to this, fairly, very reputable, as a Cal grad, I will say that, very reputable study, but also the fact that we have collected enough data to be able to show this, that for every dollar California has invested in higher education, we have gotten back $4.50 in an increase in tax revenue and a reduction in the cost of services. I'm a businesswoman. I will take that deal all day long. So, budget battles are battles of priorities, and I intend to be out there helping to get the additional funding because we have the capability. We just don't have quite the capacity.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned challenges related to college completion. And what we know is that increasingly the average college student is not 18 years old and going from mom and dad's house to college to live at a residential college. We have 4 million students in this state, or 4 million people in this state who attended college, have some credits, and have not obtained a degree. Yeah. They are oftentimes parents. They're the people who we want their kids to go to school. And so I'm wondering, when you think about completion, how we look at completion not only for the students who are in the system, but how do we think about completion for the students who have been in the system, are no longer there, and actually want to complete their degree so they have that readiness for the economy?
That's right. And, just to have a little bit of perspective, there's about 750,000 students enrolled in the CSU and the UC combined. And there are 2.1 million students in the community college system right now. And only about half of them, now not everyone is there to get some kind of certificate, but only about half of them manage to get some kind of a certificate for the studies that they do. And I think that there's been recognition. I'm not the first one to suggest that maybe we need to be looking, or, California Competes has been looking at this, but also the governor, the UCs, people are looking at this. And there's really a lot that's happening out there. And there's a lot of work to be done. Anecdotally, we all know people who switched or transferred from community college into the CSU and couldn't believe none of their classes transferred with them, or why this one and not that one, and if only they had known, right? So navigating the system is part of it as well. But there is so much at stake that the focus really is growing on helping students from day one navigate their pathway forward so that it's clear, it's crystal clear what courses they need to take, what's going to give them the credits that they need to graduate. And that, I think, is a very important part of the focus.
So what do you think the strategies are that our UC system, the CSU system, and the community college system should use to make sure that things are more aligned, so that it's really clear to students what it takes to go from a community college to a four-year institution?
Well, I guess on the macro level, Gavin Newsom has been talking about creating an oversight body. I think that has a lot of promise. I do think that there is a lot of coordination and discussion between the bodies that has produced some good results recently. But I do support the idea that whether it's, I think he's proposing to have it within the governor's office or maybe separate. But I do think that is a very good idea to try to have better coordination. I also think, there's been a lot of discussion lately about how you get good data. How do you really know, from cradle to career, how our kids are doing? And we spend more than 50% of our general fund in California on education, about 43% on K-12, another 12% on higher education. And when you are the fifth largest economy in the world and half of your budget is going to education, you really want to make sure that you are finding efficiencies, you're spending your money the right way, and you're doing it to maximize, ultimately what your goals are. So, so I do support finding out how our kids are doing. There are certainly complications of privacy issues that have been run up against, but I think that really having a better snapshot of what's going on and more transparency in spending is going to help us a lot, because otherwise, it's a little bit of guesswork.
No, the data systems is a priority that I know a lot of organizations, including the Higher Education Equity Coalition here tonight, are very, very concerned about and pursuing. You mentioned so many issues related to budgeting, and so I want to go deep a little bit there. There was a 2017 report that found that over the next 5 years, the 3 public segments will require $47 billion to maintain and upgrade facilities.
Yeah.
$47 billion. Neither the state nor the segments have a coherent plan for how to address that. And that's a huge amount. So I'm wondering, as Lieutenant Governor, what your plan would be to address those capital investment needs.
So I spent 18 years in the construction industry, and I think you have to start by looking at the number and taking it apart and really figuring out what are the priorities and how do you put those priorities in order. But I also recognize, because when I started this campaign, I went out, I hit the road, and I went to 58 counties, and I've been to over a dozen college campuses. You don't have to have a background in construction to see that our facilities on college campuses are deteriorating, and you don't have to talk to too many people to see that there is no funding, or certainly not adequate funding, to make improvements or to build more facilities. So there are a couple of ways to look at adding more funding to do capital improvements. I intend to be that person in Sacramento when budget battles come around that's kind of moving through the halls, arguing that we need to increase the contribution of the general fund to higher education. It is an investment that we cannot do without. So that's kind of the first way that I hope to be able to try to get additional funds. And then, there's the question of whether or not the voters would support bond financing for some additional expansion of our facilities. I'm not sure. I think it's really important to have a sense where voters are before you propose going out to them. But it's one of the things I think we really need to look at. And then finally, it's one of the things that I know as a Cal grad that we don't do as well as the private universities do is really ensure that we're taking advantage of the philanthropic-minded element of graduates. Alumni associations at private universities organize themselves and do enormous fundraising and capital campaigns to do all kinds of things. I sit on the advisory board at UC Berkeley's business school, and it's always really an uphill climb to try to convince graduates that even though it was a public university, it's a university that really relies on those private donations to be able to expand. And because of the efforts of our board and the dean and the former dean at UC Berkeley, there's been a pretty successful capital campaign to raise money for new facilities. But there is a lot more that we can do, not just for the graduate schools, but for undergraduates as well.
The budget questions that the state faces, there's certainly huge capital expenditures that are deferred, but there's also questions about existing resources, right? And you mentioned already maybe more money into the general fund, that needs to be a priority. There's been some work done that shows that there's an increasing mistrust of higher education on the part of the public. And a lot of that is because people expect the colleges and universities that the funding stream and that the tuition is so volatile, they don't feel like they know what they're going to pay, nor do they know if they're going to get the same value out of their degree that they once did. So I'm wondering what the budget play is in terms of thinking about the institutions. How should the state be thinking about financing higher education in the near term?
We have to think of it as an investment, because that is what it is. We have the data. We know that this big booming economy is driven by an educated workforce that has been supported to a great degree by our public education system. 33 CSU and UC campuses, 114 community colleges. We have been investing in higher education. We have been reaping the rewards of it. But with the baby boomers retiring, we need to fill more jobs. And again, we are fortunate to have those positions waiting, but it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we invest, not spend, but invest. So that is the number one argument, is that this is an investment, that we will get the money back. That is really the main argument. But secondly, I do think that as far as capital expenditures, that is something that I think voters would want to weigh in on. And then, you really make the case to the voters that this is good for them, good for their kids, good for the economy, and ultimately will build an economy that works for everyone, whether you actually attended the CSUs and the UCs or not.
In terms of the annual budgeting, though, is there room to be thinking about cost savings? Is there a space to be thinking about asking our institutions to save money, or have they already done that because they experienced the recession?
Look, I think this is delicate and very important, because we know that now, what is it, about a year and a half ago, there was an audit of the president's office that showed that there was all kinds of spending that nobody really knew about, right? That's not right. If you want to build trust among taxpayers, you need to be able to show them where their money is going. It's critical. So it starts with transparency. Secondly, it starts with making sure that your trustees and your regents are really fully engaged. The system was set up, and it's kind of interesting. We don't really think of this very often, but I was serving as ambassador in Hungary. And there was a crisis in Hungary's democracy that my embassy and I had to deal with over the course of 3.5 years. And it was that the government was looking to exert political influence over the independent institutions that make up the country's democracy. Higher education, the university system, is an independent institution of democracy. So they started to tangle with the purse strings in order to be able to have influence of what was going on in the universities. We don't really think about that here in California, because our leaders in higher education are very independent-minded. But the fact of the matter is that these systems were set up to have this level of separation. That's why you have trustees. That's why you have regents. It is their job to be providing oversight. But as these institutions have become so big and so complex, it's harder and harder for those members to really be able to assert themselves and provide leadership much more than what you see is coming at you from your staff. I mean, I think if you've ever sat on a board of directors of any kind, right, you run into this. There are some boards where the boards are doing all the work, and other ones where you're really just responding because the system's so complex. So the way I see the role of the lieutenant governor in this context then is, again, it's not about asserting political influence. Even though you are an elected official, you're still just one of many other members who are not elected, right? But that being able to raise the need for audits, raise questions about spending, raise questions about transparency, that is the job of these bodies as a whole. But as an elected representative with apparently nothing better to do as lieutenant governor, this is where I really hope to spend a lot of time.
So one thing that the lieutenant governor could do is to be a close advisor to the next governor. And so on these questions of finance, if the next governor said to you, I'm looking to figure out, we have $500 million to spend on higher ed, how would you suggest that he divvy that up?
To me, the number one way that I would allocate additional resources would be dealing with this issue that I just mentioned at the very beginning. 32,000 qualified students here in California applied to the CSU system this year, and there was no room for them. I think about my dad coming out of the fields and walking into Sacramento State University. He may not have been the most qualified person, but he had the credentials to go there, and they let him in and gave him a chance. And it changed the trajectory of our family. 38,000 students who want in, and there's no place for them. This is a travesty, and it is an opportunity that we cannot afford to let go. So I'm not sure how much of that $500 million it would cost to accommodate 32,000 more California students in our CSU system, but that would be my number one priority.
Expanding capacity. So given that that's your number one priority, think forward 4 or 8 years. You've been lieutenant governor. What would you like your legacy to be as lieutenant governor? What would you like your legacy to be to California's college students?
Well, okay, all joking aside, there are other things the lieutenant governor does actually do. So you sit on the State Lands Commission. It's the environmental protection is a strong priority for me. The federal government is trying to expand offshore drilling off of our coasts, and I've made it a very central part of my campaign that as a member of the State Lands Commission, I will do everything possible to stop offshore drilling expansion off of our coasts. As far as the economy goes, I've spent a lot of my life in housing, and the degree to which I might be able to engage on the housing issue, I would like to do that because it is a crisis that is driving Californians into poverty and onto the streets and out of the state. And then as far as higher ed goes, I think that really, if in 4 years we can see first and foremost that tuition has not increased, because I'm going to fight tuition increases tooth and nail. Secondly, if we can see added capacity so that more of those students who are being turned away have a place there. And then finally, again, going back to housing, I intend to be very, very wonky on the housing question because I have 18 years experience in delivering housing. And probably of all my time out on the road, the most heartbreaking thing I heard was up in Sonora. And I had been talking about what I'd been seeing on the road, and I had just been up at Humboldt and at Chico State and hearing stories and hearing about how expensive the housing was and not quite understanding how it could be so much. And then hearing about students who were sleeping in their cars. And as I was telling this story, there was a woman who was sitting in the circle, and she started to cry. And after we were done, she came to me and she said, you're talking about my grandson. And this is a woman who was clearly educated, whose grandson was clearly not homeless before he went to college, who was clearly not food insecure before he went to college. And you could see she felt so helpless that she couldn't provide more for him, that he would live in his car while he was going to school. And she said, but you know what? He only has 1 more year and then he's going to graduate, and I know he's going to do it. That is just not acceptable. I had a young woman in Fresno. She told me she was going to be the first in her family to go to college. By the way, this is just remarkable. California students matriculating into the UC system, 42% are the first in their family to go to college. And she said, I have the tuition piece and the fees piece taken care of. I have no idea how I'm going to come up with $16,000 to live on campus for the first year. So I have already started the process of peeling back this question of why it's costing so much to live in dormitories in places like Merced and Chico and Humboldt and Riverside, but I intend to really be very focused on that.
Ambassador Kounalakis, thank you so much
Thank
for
you,
the time.
Lande.
I want to invite Felicia Mello back to the stage.
Hi,
Hello.
good to see you.
Nice to see you.
So I'm intrigued by this whole idea of stealing students away from the private vocational schools to the community colleges. How does one do that, given that often when students are kind of at that decision point, demographically, the types of students that are ending up in some of these private schools may not have a lot of sources of information around them to be able to make an educated decision?
Well, look, marketing is very powerful. And if you're running a for-profit school for vocational training and you're signaling and advertising to people, come here, do this degree, and go on to build your future, of course they're going to respond to that. I'm not suggesting that, well, let me put it this way. When I say stealing, that's really what I mean. If we can...
I'm glad you clarified.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to double down on that because it's true. If we, through the high school process, can help students see that these opportunities exist for them in the community college system and they don't have to pay for it, and they may not get a shiny brochure and they may not get a whole bunch of marketing coming at them, but that the education that they get on the other side of it is going to be just as valuable, if not more valuable to them, and they'll be able to do it in a much more cost-efficient way. So I think it's very, very important that we increase the information that students have about what kind of degree they can get at community colleges and how that will be beneficial to them if what they're really doing is looking for a job. But that's not the only thing. You know, one of the issues with getting a certificate at community colleges is you have requirements that you may not be really good at, right? So I was in I was in Riverside County in, what's the name of that town? Fontana. Beautiful place, Fontana. And the mayor of Fontana, Mayor Aquanetta, sat me down with a whole bunch of manufacturing leaders, and they were talking about what they're looking for in terms of a trained workforce. And they're doing a lot of training themselves for welding and working in machines and other things. And these are good paying jobs, by the way. And one of the things they said is that students may want to go to a community college to be able to get some of the training that would be beneficial for them as employers. But in order to actually get a certificate, you have other courses you need to take that many of these students they're just not good at it. And they found what they're good at. And I think that looking at this question and providing some additional flexibility in the kinds of associate degrees that we're giving out of the community colleges is something I think that we really need to look at.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. I think there are some in California that feel that the new online college as part of the California community colleges is going in that direction, right? Providing some more flexible options for students. And then there are folks that have concerns, right? That are concerned that this might represent a dumbing down of the education that students are getting, or that they won't have enough contact with faculty. What's your view on the role that technology can play in solidifying those paths toward vocational education and certificates?
Well, this is distance learning is something we absolutely have to be looking at. And it is a new frontier. So we do want to be careful. You know Sal Khan, who started Khan Academy?
Yeah.
I met him once, and I had this burning question. So I raced up to the front after he finished talking, and I said, let me ask you something. If you were talking to a chancellor at a four-year university, what advice would you give them to be able to keep up and compete with what you're doing online? And it was interesting. You know what he said? He said, well, I have kids. I have kids too. I have kids. And I want my kids to go to a four-year university. Right? Interesting. And his argument was that what you get out of proximity and community of being on campus, of having face-to-face interaction with teachers, with professors, with instructors, with administrators, you know, the kind of support that you get, you cannot replace that online, at least not, you know, in 2018, right? But the fact is that what we know as we look at this capacity issue is that augmenting a student's educational journey through community colleges, and if they choose through the UC and the CSU, surely there are going to be opportunities for some level of online learning that will be complementary and additive to the process without necessarily taking away all of the things that make the college experience what it is.
Speaking of the college experience kind of writ large, so you and I both went to UC Berkeley for graduate school. Go Bears. And you attended Dartmouth College as an undergrad, which is an Ivy League school with a sizable endowment. And I think would be fair to say that the undergraduate experience there is probably fairly different from the experience at California's public universities, where funding is more uncertain, as we've been discussing. A lot of students are coming from low-income families and really kind of having to struggle to make ends meet. How will you relate, given your background, to today's UC and CSU undergrads and their experiences?
Well, I relate very closely because, look, there's that thing called growth mentality. I had a big imagination when I was a kid. I was growing up in an immigrant community in rural Sacramento, the end of a dirt road, you know, where we grew our own vegetables and you know, shot BB guns and fished, and right. But I read books. I read a lot, and I had this glamorous idea of Ivy League universities. So I found this world, tracked it down, did well in school because I was always a hard worker. And I applied and I got into Dartmouth. And it was not the right place for me. I felt like nobody there was like me. I didn't look like them. They all knew each other. It was very, very difficult for me at that school. I took a year off. I went to Greece. I worked in Greece in a newspaper and on an archaeology site. And then I went to Berkeley for graduate school. And I really never looked back because Berkeley was so embracing. It was so comfortable. It felt so much that people were like me at Berkeley. And with all of this time and distance, because I never really talked about my time at Dartmouth, everybody says, "Oh, didn't you love it?" "Oh, yeah, I loved it." The fact of the matter is I lived in the library and I lived at the newspaper where I worked as a reporter and an editor later. But when I went to UC Merced recently, I had just the most beautiful day. If you want a day of inspiration, go to UC Merced. 72% of the students at UC Merced are the first in their family to go to college. And here is this big, beautiful, brand new school. And the message is, this is all for you. This is here for you. You're not being plucked down into this world that thinks differently and that is, no. The people of California, the taxpayers of California, the leadership of California knows that you have talent, that you are the future, and we are going to give you the opportunity to achieve the kinds of things that, just like my grandmother, your grandmother could never have imagined. So I relate very viscerally to that experience. And more than that, I have absolute faith that given the opportunity to achieve higher education, young people can really do anything.
One more on housing before we wrap up,
Sure.
since it is one of your areas of expertise. So when I was doing a story about homeless students, I was talking to the case manager at Sacramento State, and she's the one who helps students that are either on the verge of being homeless, experiencing some other kind of difficulty with their housing. And I asked her, what's the one thing that would actually make a difference for your students? And she was saying, students are, what's affordable for my students to pay for rent is like $300 to $500 a month, right? That doesn't exist in our area. And she said, well, what would really make a difference is to have some kinds of controls on the rents in the area immediately around our campus. To say, if you're offering housing in this, 1 mile vicinity of campus, say, you can only charge X amount. And I'm curious, as a former developer, what do you think of a solution like that? And, part two, what else can you say about, how, based on your background, what other solutions might you bring to the table?
Look, I think in a perfect world, you can find perfect solutions. But these kinds of things tend to be a lot more complicated. So the way I see the opportunity for providing affordable housing on college campuses is we need to build more, and we need to do it in a way that assures that it's being offered to the students affordably. Something has happened out there where probably, like all things, the recession has created so much pressure on budgets of all kinds, but particularly budgets in higher education, that if you can raise the prices of living in a dorm to $800 a month, on a dorm that is probably paid for free and clear up in Chico, right? Probably doesn't cost the university $800 a bed to provide that, but you can get that income and use it to fill other budget gaps. That, I fear, is what has happened. And what I would like to do, if I am so fortunate to be elected and serve on the CSU and the UC, is start by requesting data from the campuses of how they determine what they are charging their students. I have already heard this answer as I have visited campuses. The answer is market. So we have to rethink this, and it's, to me, going to be important to put pressure on the campuses that profiting off of the dormitories, they're not profiting, that's the wrong word, because our administrators, our faculties, they're just trying to figure out how to cover all the costs. But the fact of the matter is that if they are using income from housing to be able to pay for other things, we've got to ask some hard questions at the state level, because essentially it's just more tuition, particularly because many of these campuses require freshmen to live on campus. So, yeah.
How do you handle the off-campus housing?
I think, as I said before, I think it is harder as a member of the CSU and the UC to figure out how to create affordable off-campus housing than it is to create affordable on-campus housing, which is really what I intend to work on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both. Before we wrap, I just wanted to recap a couple of things that I heard that I thought were important for all of us to be thinking about as we think about the future of higher ed. One is the imperative around access, right? That we need to make sure that there's a spot for everyone, and that we need to make sure that the access promise is deliberate in terms of thinking about who are our students, that it needs to better reflect the students of this state, students of color, low-income students, students who are brown and black, who are men who aren't getting through, that those are all really important priorities for this state. There's a really important question around affordability and what we are doing as a state to really cover the total cost of attendance for our students, and we need a strategy to address that. I also heard lots of discussion about capacity, that our institutions actually need to be supported to make sure that there is a spot for everyone, so that the promise of the master plan as we know it is able to be fulfilled. There's a question of how we do that in a way that makes sure that we are aligned with the needs of the workforce today, that simply graduating from college by itself is not sufficient unless you are actually prepared to be able to take up your spot in today's economy. And then there's the issue of success, that we can't give students the promise for education without actually helping them to move through. So I think those are really good and interesting and important issues for us to be thinking about as we think about this role of the lieutenant governor. And I wanted to, before we end, invite Monica Lozano back to the stage to have a few parting comments.
Thank you, Lande. And I also wanted to remember not to touch the mic. I want to thank the candidates. It was an extraordinary conversation to really understand their perspectives on higher education. Not just the role of higher education unto itself, but really how it contributes to our economy and to our democracy. And in addition to the themes that Lande just surfaced, capacity, access, affordability, etc., I wanted to remind everybody that today is actually National Voter Registration Day. And in fact, according to the Sacramento Bee, California teens are registering to vote like never before. They're active, they're informed, and they're engaged. And our young people recognize the importance, the strength, the value of their vote. We hope all of you in this room and everybody watching also understands how important your vote is for the future of California, and in particular, for this particular race, the lieutenant governor. So thank you all for joining us. To California Competes, to CalMatters, to our candidates, thank you all very much for being here.